Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Good. I'm going to use a new technology. You're all bored with PowerPoint. You know, everybody uses PowerPoint, but I persuaded George Soros to invest in the very latest, which is PowerPoint Interactive. And that's why we got this here. So PowerPoint Interactive works like this. I speak, and as I speak, you visualize the points that I'm making on this screen. All right? Now, it doesn't mean you've got to use your brains, unlike PowerPoint, but it's more fun. Right? So that's what we're going to try. In other words, I'm going to talk and you're going to listen and think. Right? And I asked for this sort of walkabout microphone because it's more fun if I sort of sit here, I think. Let's see if we can get this thing up. That's better. To start with, just the obvious, natural resources are a huge opportunity. And they're a huge risk. No other activity has the same combination of massive upside opportunity and massive downside risk. And that's why public policy really, really matters for natural resources. Far more than most other areas of public policy. In quite a few areas of public policy, you can sort of get away with very big differences in policy. Hong Kong had an industrial policy of do absolutely nothing, right? And Singapore had an industrial policy of very active, pick the winners, right? Well, they've both done very well, you know? So within reason, it didn't matter that much. You know, you do one, and as long as you did it well, it works. Do the other, as long as you do it well, it worked. It's sort of health policy. You know, America, you sort of complete private market. Britain, it's a very public sector activity. They both got similar health outcomes. You know, the British think the British is better, the Americans think the Americans is better, but they both seem to live a long time. But with natural resources, the difference between getting it right and getting it wrong is just massive, massive. You look at some of the richest countries in the world, like Norway, and there's a country that got it right. You know? And you look at some of the poorest countries in the world. Should we take Sierra Leone? And there's a country that got it wrong. I mean, I could have done Botswana and Sierra Leone. Let's take a look at that for a second. You know, it's the same resource. It's diamonds. It's the same continent. It's Africa. Yeah? If you go back 50 years, they were both dirt poor, Botswana and Sierra Leone. The only difference was that Sierra Leone had a great coastal position, some of the best real estate in the world, and Botswana was a landlocked desert. You know. And then you roll on to the present, and Sierra Leone is bottom of the world's Human Development Index, and Botswana is the highest per capita income country in Africa. For many years, Botswana was the fastest growing country, not just in Africa, but in the world. You know? Same damn resource, diamonds. You know? So policy choices are just massive here. You can go up like a rocket, or you can go hell. why? What's distinctive about natural resources? And I'll run through 5 respects in which they're distinctive quickly. And then we're going to look at the chain of policy choices. So why are they distinct? One respect is that natural resources, they're under the ground. They're hidden. You don't start knowing what you've got. You've got to find them. And the process of finding them, the discovery process, is itself an activity which can go right or go wrong. In fact, let me give you the one number that in 10 years you will still remember from this course. Right? Now that's a challenge, right? I mean, I've got to be fairly confident about this to be able to say that. Let's see, because if you can't remember it tomorrow, then I've really lost, you know. Think of 2 squares. You ain't got any squares. But this will have to be a square. Right? That's going to represent the typical square. Do you think in kilometers or miles? Kilometers, right? This is the typical square kilometer of the rich world, the OECD. Right? OECD, all the countries that have got fairly high per capita income. So that's the typical square kilometer. Right? And we're going to look underneath. And this square here is the typical square kilometer of Africa. Right? So it's a typical square kilometer of OECD, typical square kilometer of Africa. And we're going to look underneath those square kilometers. Fortunately, the seats lift up. Right? So we look underneath, and what do we find? Well, underneath this typical square kilometer of the OECD, there's $125,000 worth of subsoil assets underneath the ground. Right? Oil, diamonds, gold, $125,000. That's the OECD. Right? Germany, France, and America, all the, you know, what have you. And now we're going to look underneath the typical square kilometer of Africa. And I can see it, but you can't. And to make it more fun, instead of me telling you, you're going to tell me. I've already told you that's $125,000. So that's Africa. And to make it at least manageable, I'm going to give you a choice. It could be less than the OECD, and it could be more. Right? And you've got to vote on it. Right? But that's all you've got to decide. Is the Africa less or more than the OECD? Right? But you've got to vote. Right? So everybody who thinks that that typical square kilometer of Africa is less than the OECD, hands up now. And everybody who thinks it's more, hands up now. Now, some people seem to be armless. And people who haven't got any arms can put a leg up, but we've got to put something up. So we're going to take it again, right? So less than the OECD. Arms or legs up, right? More arms or legs up. Very important. I mean, you've still not voted. You're up. Okay. Okay. Anybody not voted? You've not voted? You've got to vote, more or less.
Well, I couldn't tell because the value you put on the natural resources depends on what you're putting in value in it?
Market value.
Market value. So let's see Africa.
Very important that you all vote, right? Because you're nearly all wrong. You're nearly all very wrong. And the reason that's important is this is why you've got to remember it, right? The 3 people who got it right, which I must say is very impressive proportion. I've done this with, I don't know, 10 to 20,000 people now, so I'm pretty confident that the ratio of getting it wrong is about 98%, right? I've done this with professional investment managers in the audience. I once had $4 trillion in the audience, 250 top investment managers. They were 100% wrong, you know. So these are the wise people who invest your money. This is why Mr. Soros made so much money, because he's facing idiots, right? The right number is 25,000. In other words, it's only about a fifth of what's in the OECD. Now, I must say, in all these thousands of people I've asked, there's only one guy who got it right, but he got the right answer to the wrong question. But he just shouted out, Paul, he said, it's obvious, they're the same. And that was a guy called Roger Myerson, who's got a Nobel laureate in economics. And what he did in his head very quickly was think, oh, these are very large areas. The OECD, Africa, huge. And the geology underneath them is just localized random processes that happened 60 million years ago. What do I know about locally random processes over very big areas? The mean of the distributions will be the same. And so he said that they'll be the same. But that was the right answer, but to the wrong question. What the question he answered was what's really down there. Right? I don't know what's down there. Nobody does. Right? Because a lot of stuff hasn't been discovered. Right? The figures I've given you are not for what's down there, it's what's been discovered. Right? So what you've learned is not that Africa's got less than the OECD. It's probably got about the same, probably a bit more, because OECD's been digging the stuff out for 200 years, and there's still $125,000 worth left there. Right? What you've discovered, what you've learned, is that most of Africa's natural resources haven't yet been discovered. Right? Yeah? So that's why you're going to remember this in 10 years' time. Right? So that's the implication of the stuff being hidden. Right? The next big implication of the next big distinctiveness about natural resources is that, and this is an economic concept, which is that the value of natural resources includes a component of rent as well as profit. So when you extract natural resources, some of the value that you extract, the market value, is what economists call rents, as distinct from profits. And rents are a technical term in economics. But it's very important for you to understand what it means. Right? And if you're not an economist, you don't understand it at the moment. Right? So we're going to try and do it in the next 3 or 4 minutes. How many people in the audience are economists? 1 or 2. 1 or 2. Right? You might need to go and, over coffee, sit with them and say, so what are these bloody things called rents, right? But anyway, here's the here's the simple explanation. Yeah? You take a barrel of oil out of the ground. Once you've got it out of the ground, at the moment it's worth about $55 or something like that. Right? Generally doesn't cost anything like $55 to get it out of the ground. Right? Cost of getting it out of the ground is searching for it, drilling for it, hiring a bit of labour, ships, drilling rigs, paying people to bear the risk, the capital risk. The return on capital and risk is what we call profit. And we have a concept of a normal profit rate, which is the amount of profit that people have got to earn in order to be willing to risk their capital. Right? If they don't get that profit, they're not going to be there. The oil's not going to be discovered, or it's going to stay in the ground. Right? So that's the profit. And then if you don't pay labour, nobody will come and work on the rigs. Right? So all these costs, the cost of capital, the cost of labour, they are the costs of getting the oil out of the ground, the full costs of getting the oil out of the ground. Might be $10. Might sometimes be 20. Sometimes it's 2. Right? It's never 50. Right? So once you've got the oil out of the ground into a barrel, it's $55. Right? Suppose you spent $20 in cost getting it out of the ground. And that includes the profit on all the risk capital and so forth that's been needed. Right? The other $35 is rent. It accrues to whoever owns that barrel of oil, but it doesn't pay them for anything that they've done. It doesn't pay them for any capital they've used, doesn't pay them for any risk they've taken, doesn't pay them for any work they've done. Right? It's just that they have ownership title over something which is valuable. That is the economic concept of rent. And the key distinction is that rent is not a return on a factor of production. Factors of production are the things needed to produce stuff. Labour, capital, land. Yeah.
In that case, if you're talking about a company that does the extraction, what of that $55 a barrel, which part is defined as a profit then to them?
So it will be whatever the return is that makes it sensible for them as a company to say, yeah, we'll risk our capital here and put our managerial effort in. Yeah. If they can get all $55, then, you know, they'll take it. But the point is the amount that's needed to get them into that game will be a lot less than $55.
Excuse me, is that the same as loyalty? If you're not talking about oil and gas, if you're talking about other minerals like maybe gold or something, is that the same as loyalty?
Royalty, you're thinking. We're going to come to royalties, but royalties are a form of taxation. Yeah? But the rent, which is just value that accrues to whoever has ownership title, right? It's not a return on any activity. Yeah? Well, that raises the question, yeah? It's entirely dependent. Sorry? Yeah. So rents can be anything. I mean, it varies both over time, which we'll come to, and by commodity. For example, the rents on coal, pretty small. Pretty small. Because there's coal in an awful lot of places. So coal isn't very scarce. And so the market price of coal is pretty close to the cost of getting it out of the ground. So rents differ a lot by commodity, and they vary over time, depending upon what the demand for the commodity is. But the key feature of rents here is that they accrue to ownership, not to activity. But there isn't any, because there's no activity involved in being the owner, there are no such things as natural owners of natural resources. The resources are natural, but the ownership isn't. The ownership is purely a social construct. I mean, with most things, you know, here's a pen. Who owns it? Well, at the moment I do, but you know, the first person to own it was the guy who made it, or the firm that made it. Right? And then it says Hilton on it, so Hilton Hotels evidently bought a load of these pens so that the ownership transferred from the company which made them to the hotel. And then it left them in the rooms for people like me to pick up, you know. So ownership started with the production process. Whoever made it owned it. Right? With natural resources, nobody made them. Right? So there are no natural owners to natural resources. Ownership is just socially assigned. Right? So we're going to have to come to discussion at some stage, well, who owns the stuff? Right? We'll have that discussion this afternoon, but I'll leave you with the news that before you came in, I sellotaped underneath one of the seats a $100 bill. Whose is it? Okay. We'll discuss this afternoon. Whose is it? Okay. No looking. Okay, so the key implication of rents and this fact that ownership of rents is just socially to be determined, the key implication of that is that governments better design a tax system of natural resources which gets the rents to the government. And that's not easy. So that's why you need a distinctive tax system for natural resources. On pens, there are no rents. The value of this pen is basically the cost of making it. And so when you tax the production of pens, all that you can tax is the capital used in making it or the labour used in making it. And that's what a normal tax system does. It's designed to tax labour incomes and capital incomes. Rents are quite different. Most countries, rents don't matter very much, and so you don't have tax systems which deal with rents. But countries with a lot of natural resources, rents become absolutely central to the design of the tax system. And you need a different design. So again, why are natural resources distinctive? First, they're hidden. Second, there's these big rents. Third respect in which natural resources are distinctive is that They're an enclave extraction process. Stuff is taken out of the ground, from under the ground. That process itself is just physically, it's a physical process which is rather a mess, right? You know, digging stuff up. But the design of the economic operation of extracting resources tends to be an enclave activity. Because very often these places are in the middle of nowhere. And so companies that do extraction have learnt how to do extraction in a way that doesn't really interact with the surroundings. You dig a hole, you drill a well. You know, I mean, the most manifest is offshore oil. You know, it's got to be an enclave because all you've got around you is fish, right? They're not going to help. So you set up an operation which doesn't depend upon anything around you. You just drill a hole, right? But if it's not offshore, if it's onshore activity, there's people living there, you know. And so there's a whole issue of what's the interaction with the local other than having their world dug up around them, you know. So hidden rents, enclave extraction, and then two features of the revenue flow. One is it's volatile. Just lived through it, right? Oil price just crashed a few months ago, right? If you think about it for a moment, you'll realize that if the oil price goes from, say, $100 to $50, here's a question to make you actually use your brain. If the oil price goes from $100 to $50, what happens to the rents? Go.
Goes from 100 to 50.
The price of oil goes from 100 to 50. The cost of extraction, let's say, is 20. So what happens to the rents? From what to what?
70 to 50, or 70 to 30.
80?
80 to 30.
80 to 30. 80 to 30, right? Because the costs of taking the stuff out of the ground have stayed the same, right? More or less. Right? So if the price is... Now, I've halved the price. Right? I've gone from 100 to 50. So I've halved the price. But the rents have gone from 80 to 30. So the rents have more than halved. Yeah? You get it? So if you've got a tax stream, which is basically a tax stream of the rents, when the oil price halves, your revenue crunches even worse than that. Yeah? Suppose the oil price fell from 100 to 20, what would happen to your rents?
Gone.
They'd disappear. Yeah. That's why not only are prices volatile, but revenue flows to governments are even more volatile than the prices, because they're geared on the price. If the tax system's doing its job, it's actually taxing those rents, and the rents are very volatile. So the policy implication of that is you're going to have to ride this tiger. You're going to have to try and smooth things out. Right? We've just come out of a super cycle, the commodity super cycle. It's over. Right? And a lot of governments have done spectacularly badly in riding the tiger. You know? If you're going to ride a tiger that's going up and down, just thinking very simply, what you do when prices are high? You save. Right? So that when prices are low, you can dissave, you know? What did a lot of governments do when prices were high? Spend, and even worse than spend, borrow. Right? 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 And now we're in the phase where the chickens are coming home to roost. Right? That's called the IMF coming in. Right? IMF goes, cluck, 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 cluck. We're a chicken, you know? And Ghana, Zambia. We've got some Ghanaians here. I don't know if we've got any Zambians. Hi. Yeah, you're in chicken phase time at the moment in Ghana, I'm afraid, you know. Okay, so volatility, the fourth distinctive feature of natural resources. Price of pens don't go up and down as much as that, right? And remember, there are no rents on pens, so even if the price of pens did go up and down a bit, it wouldn't matter for revenue, right? Then the final revenue feature is that these revenues coming from natural resource extraction are unsustainable. And there's two reasons why they're unsustainable. The one that you can even manage to grasp on a Monday morning is that if you're taking stuff out of the ground, eventually there won't be any left. Right? It's a physical process, it's going to run out. Right? So that's the sort of obvious respect of unsustainability. But there's a much more important source of unsustainability, but it's a bit more subtle. And this is from technical obsolescence. And to give you that idea, just let me tell you a story. Back in October, I was brought into Chile. Anybody from Chile? Yes. Of course. So I was brought in by the Central Bank of Chile to, believe it or not, to advise on management of copper. Well, you know, I mean, Chile has the finest system in the world for smoothing price shocks, the volatility of prices. Got a brilliant system. So I thought there's nothing I can tell them about smoothing volatility. So I thought, what am I going to say? So I thought, well, I'll tell them about obsolescence. So I don't know a lot about the technology of copper, believe it or not. You know, I'm an economist, not a whatever it would be to know about copper. But Google's a wonderful thing. So in about a couple of hours, I was world expert on the future technology of copper. And I thought, why might copper become technologically obsolete? So as an economist, I just used the economic concept. Something could happen to supply, something could happen to demand. So what could happen to supply? The world is certainly not going to run out of copper, by the way. There's masses of copper everywhere. Right? And in fact, that's Chile's problem. Not that copper's going to run out physically, but there's so much in the rest of the world. Chile's advantage is that its copper is close to the surface. And so it's cheap to get out. It's cheaper to get copper in Chile than it is to get copper in Hungary. There'll be a lot of copper in Hungary, right? And so on and so forth. Right? But it turns out there's people working on a new technology. Not only is there copper in pretty well every country on Earth, there's a lot of copper on the seabed. And so they're developing technologies to lift copper cheaply off the seabed. Now, if that technology develops, Chile is actually at a big disadvantage. Because although it's got a lot of coast, the water is very, very deep. And so the countries that will be favoured will be countries with shallow coastal shoals. So it's quite possible that in 20 years, 30 years' time, there'll be a new technology which lifts copper off the seabed. In which case, Chile's lost its production advantage. So there's so much for supply. Then I thought, what about demand? Where's the demand for copper? Well, back home we have a copper kettle. So that was my first thought of what you use copper for. But actually copper kettles are only a very, very small component of the demand for copper. What's the main use of copper in the world? Electrical wires. Wires, right? Why? Why? Because copper is very good at conductivity. Right? I learned that because my 13-year-old son was taking some exam and I had to teach him elementary, whatever it was, physics, I suppose, and there it was, all about copper conductivity. Right? And then I thought, I wonder if in 100 years' time, we'll still be conducting electricity through copper wires. Will we still be plugging things in 100 years' time? Right? Well, kind of once you pose that question, you more or less answered it. It's really pretty unlikely that your great-grandchildren will still be plugging things in at a wall, your grandchildren will be telling them, Granddad used to have to plug things in. And so we don't know when this will happen. We don't know when this will happen, but sometime in the next century, everything will be wireless. Now, if things go wireless, the demand for copper collapses. Anyway, so I said this to the Chileans, thinking that they'd say, why on earth did we waste $10,000 flying this guy in from, Europe? And instead, they said, basically, oh my God, why didn't we think of this ourselves? We, of all people, should know about technological obsolescence of natural resources. And they told me the story, which I didn't know, I should have done, but it's the story of Chilean nitrates. And this goes back to the latter part of the 19th century. Nitrates were the boom commodity of the late 19th century. And the main world supply of natural nitrates was Chile. And so Chile grew rich for 50 years on extracting natural nitrates. And the rent, because it was the main source of supply, the rents off nitrates were huge. In fact, they were more than 50% of Chile's government's revenue. For half a century, more than 50% of Chile's government revenue was taxes on nitrates. And then in 1920, a German scientist discovered how to synthesize nitrates chemically. And the world price of natural nitrates completely collapsed and never recovered. And so the rents disappeared overnight. And so Chile had had 50 years of these big rents which disappeared, never to return. So when I told them that could happen to copper, they thought, it really can, it really will, and we're doing nothing about it. We've got a plan to ride the ups and downs of short-term shocks in the copper price, but we've no plan at all for what happens when the rents on copper run out. So that's the real unsustainability of natural resource revenues. Yes, you'll run out at some stage. There's an Arab sheikh called Sheikh Yemeni, who was the head of OPEC for a while, who came out with the brilliant phrase. It was when oil prices first were high. And he said, you know, the Stone Age didn't end because the world ran out of stone. Huh? Absolutely right. Huh? The Stone Age did end. Huh? And his implication was the oil age is going to end. But it won't end because the world runs out of oil. It'll end because technology moves on and finds a less messy way of generating energy. Right? I mean, the universe is nothing but energy. There's so much energy in the universe that the idea that in 100 years we'll still be taking this messy black stuff out of the ground and burning it, you know, seems very unlikely. So those are the, what are the implications of unsustainability? That you better save quite a lot of these revenues whilst you've got them. Right? Not save just to smooth revenues on the ups and downs, but save for the day when the rents on these things disappear. Right? Now, technological obsolescence happens to everything. It's not distinctive to natural resources. You know, 100 years' time, pens won't look like this. They might not look like anything at all, right? You know, goodness knows what it'll be like. You might just have to imagine a pen and it appears, you know. The difference is that there aren't any rents on pens. And so technological obsolescence in pens doesn't matter. There's no rents to disappear. Okay? But technological obsolescence in natural resources means that the rents disappear. Okay? So that's what's distinctive. So what you've learnt so far is that natural resources have huge scope for going right and going wrong. Botswana versus Sierra Leone. Right? Norway versus DRC. Right? Policy really matters in this area, and policy has to be distinctive because natural resources are distinctive. Right? Now, there's nothing for it but to roll up our sleeves and go through the long march of the economic decision chain. The chain of decisions involved in getting natural resources right. And that's the next thing we're going to do, and that will take all morning. Yeah? Then in the afternoon, we'll turn to looking at policy levers. What are the distinctive types of policy that will be useful in dealing with natural resources? All the time, you should be thinking, how does this relate to my own country? Did my own country get this bit of the decision chain right? Did it use this particular type of policy? You know? So all the time in the background, what I'm saying is only useful if you map it into your own context, right? That's why we're using PowerPoint Interactive, right? Because you've got to use your own brain to fit it into your own context, right? Okay. Now, the next question is not a vote on is it more or is it less. It's, I don't know what the schedule is for this morning, so I know we've got a break at some time. Since I've got a great tendency just to drone on forever, I need to know when I've got to stop. When's the coffee break?
Coffee break is at 10:30, but it's up to 12 to decide.
And how long is it?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay, I suggest can we shift it to 11:15, and we'll take it 11:45 to 11, okay? And when is lunch break? 12:45. That's great, okay? So we're going to go on till 10:45. There's a clock in front of me, I'll probably see, right? If I've missed it, then you can all just say, shut up, you know. Okay, so we're going to start at the first link in the decision chain. And it's a link that you already know is broken. It's just that you don't know that you know it's broken. Right? Let's go back to that number that I gave you. Okay? It was specific to Africa. I could have taken any area of poor countries. You'd have got very similar numbers. Okay? I should say those numbers were for the millennium. They were for the year 2000. So as of the year 2000, so much less of Africa's natural resources have been discovered than of the OECD's natural resources. And that tells you that the discovery process had gone wrong in Africa. It wasn't that just people stuck holes in the ground and they were unlucky, there wasn't anything there. Not enough holes were stuck in the ground. Right? And that didn't just happen. Sticking holes in the ground is an economic activity. There's a whole, those of you who are economists, what we're doing is part of the economics of information. It's been a huge area of economics in the last 40 years. Nobel laureates, Joe Stiglitz, George Akerlof, Michael Spence. Nobel laureates in the economics of information. Right? So that's the sort of stuff I'll be drawing on in the next 15, 20 minutes or so. So, incidentally, that's why, that number that I've given you, that's why that when commodity prices went up a lot over the last decade, there was so much exploration in Africa, because it was the least explored continent, so the companies knew, well, we're going to find natural resources. There's a lot to discover in Africa, you know. There's still a lot to discover. Right? It's still the case that most of the natural resources in poor countries haven't yet been discovered. Okay? So getting the process of discovery right is really kind of important. So, step one is discovery. We're going to come across two sorts of problems. And we'll set the problems out, and then we'll look to solutions. And the first problem is known technically in economics as time inconsistency. So those of you who have done enough economics, what you're about to come across now is just an application of the concept of time inconsistency. Those of you who are not economists, you don't need to know that, right? Except that you just need to know that, don't worry, somebody got a Nobel Prize for this, right? Not me. But we're going to introduce the concept by role playing, right? So I am the president of the, what should we call it? The People's Popular Democratic Republic of whatever, right? I've actually, I'm so popular that I president for life. My people just love me, and so they've given complete power to me and my family, my nice family. So it's now time to, my children seem to be spending a lot of money, so actually the country needs to discover some natural resources, and you have been invited. You are the chief executives of international natural resource companies, right? So welcome to the People's Democratic Republic, right? And here's the map of the People's Democratic Republic, and we're going to now bid for the license which I will sign, giving you the rights to resource extraction. Right? And there's some reason to think that that here there might be oil. We don't know. Nobody's drilled a hole. That cost a lot of money, but we reckon there's a 1 in 10 chance, right, that there's oil. And if you find oil, it's $1 billion discovery value. Right? And I don't want to mess about with complicated taxes and what have you. Here's the document which gives you the oil, all of it, and you're going to bid for this bit of paper that gives you those rights. Right? So basically, ladies and gentlemen, chief executives, what I'm selling is a 1 in 10 chance of you having $1 billion. So the auction starts now and will close in 1 minute's time. What am I bid? Yes. Sir. You're bidding $100 million. A very wise bid, sir, if I may say so. And here is the document with my signature. I think that's a very fair bid. You have got the money, haven't you? It has to be in used $100 bills now. But thank you very much, sir. Now, did he do the right thing? He's just spent $100 million. There's 2 possible outcomes. He now goes and he drills the hole, right? What are the 2 possible outcomes? Oil or no oil, right? Okay, so one option is he drills the hole and 9 out of 10 times you don't find anything. I will give you a Kleenex tissue, right? But I've got to keep the $100 million, obviously. Now let's play the other scenario. You strike oil. Okay. And now what might happen? He does what? He gives me the tissue. Now we're going to change your roles, except for him. You stay as the chief executive, right? You're still the chief executive with this bit of paper with the president's signature on it. Okay? All the rest of you are now citizens of the People's Democratic Republic. Okay? And you love me, remember, right? And now I announce to you, we've discovered oil. And we sold all the oil for $100 million. We have, unfortunately, in this country, I've not been able to block Google and Twitter and all the rest of it. I tried, believe me. So what do my loving, happy people say? Well done?
What do we get?
You're an idiot.
Yeah, I'm sorry, what did you say? It's worth $1 billion. And it was sold for 100 million. Well, that does appear to be true. But that was because we didn't know there was oil there. We didn't know. Do you think I knew? Do you think he knew? Or maybe he did know. Oh, maybe he knew. You did. What should we do with that bit of paper?
Negotiate.
We try to get a lot as we can from him.
Maybe.
And suppose that, so I'm going to play the scene forward a little bit. So it may be that I, the president, say, you're a crook, you knew. You knew. We're not honouring that one. Or it may be that you are the leader of the opposition, say, accuse me, believe it or not, of being a crook. That I knew there was oil down there. And $100 million has flowed into the national treasury, but something closer to 900 million has flown into my pocket, you know. Now, here's the key thing is, actually, you can work all this out beforehand. Okay? In other words, paying $100 million for something that is actually worth $100 million. You're quite right. This is the correct price for a 1 in 10 chance of $1 billion, 100 million. Right? You paid, in one sense, you paid the correct value. Right? But there's only two possible outcomes. One, you lose your money, and the other is you get something which is actually so good that it's not going to be honoured. You know, the contract is not robust. There's no way that I, as the president, can credibly commit to letting you have $1 billion having paid only 100 million for it, right? Right? So, knowing that, is it wise of you to bid $100 million? Suppose that you bid $50 million. Does that make the thing better?
It depends on the rules of the game, the rules of the bid process.
There's no guarantee that the contract or the agreement will be enforced. I would a little bit lower.
Exactly. So this may be a case where, although it's not worth 100 million, lowering the price actually intensifies the problem. You know, if you only paid $5 million for this, it's obvious the bloody thing's going to be torn up, isn't it? And so there actually just may be no market. You know? And that's one explanation for why so little was discovered. Unless you have credible contexts, yeah, in which contracts can be trusted, you can't actually operate a market in the discovery process. That's one reason why why there's only $25,000 underneath that chair. And now let's have a look at another. So that's one problem, time consistency problem. Time consistency problem just means that as president, it's rational for me to make a commitment at the time when I'm selling the prospect, but it's not rational for me to keep the commitment once the information's come in. You know? Now let's have a look at the second problem. And suppose now, here's my country, and each of these chairs is a little prospect. So as it were, the map is just a lot of little squares, little prospects. And I'm the president again, and you're the companies, and I sell the prospects. You know? And you each buy a prospect. You've actually bought a prospect. You've each bought a prospect. In fact, you're sitting on the prospect you bought, right? And so it'll cost you $20 to get up and have a look under your chair. Right? Maybe stuff there, may not. You know. This is not the $100 bill case. This is where we've sort of, there's a puddle of oil somewhere, and the puddle of oil, that's the, you know, so kind of. We don't know where the puddle is, but maybe it's here, you know. So if the situation's like that, we don't know where this circle is, it's somewhere, and it costs you $20 to look under your seat, what's the sensible thing to do? This is not easy. Yeah?
Can you drill in between seats?
No. You can either pay me $20 and have a look under your chair, or sit still for a bit, or wait. Anybody want to pay me $20? The right thing to do is to wait for somebody else to pay $20. Right? Suppose this is your seat, and somebody here pays $20, here. They all pay $20. Is it worth you paying $20? Not really. Suppose you're sitting here, and somebody here has paid $20 and gone, yippee! What are you going to do? Pay me $20, right? What we've just sketched is the economics of a gold rush. The basic message of 40 years of the economics of information, all these Nobel laureates and stuff, is that market processes, free market processes, don't work very well with information. Information is not a normal good like carrots or cabbages. And so if you do prospecting just as if a prospect was a carrot, what you'll get is a long period of inactivity. And then some clot will spend the $20 and strike lucky. And then you go from too little investment in prospecting to too much. Everybody will move in. Gold rushes, that's what they were. Phases where some idiot had blundered into a discovery, and then you get far too much prospecting. And that arises because each hole that's dug generates not just information about the hole itself, but about the surroundings. Right? So there's what economists call an externality. There's a spillover of information. So those are the big sort of technical problems in the discovery process. The time consistency problem, being unable credibly to commit to allowing investors to have very big gains on investments. And the externality involved in the spillover of information from one discovery onto prospects in the neighborhood. Yeah? So what's the solutions? The first solution is since information is an area where the market doesn't work that well, it's a good idea first to generate some public geological information. So public geological information doesn't mean the government having to do its own geology, but it does mean that government has to commission geological information and then make it publicly available. For example, let's think what it would do to this problem. Suppose we were able to say, oh, it's not this area that has a 1 in 10 chance, it's this area that has a 1 in 2 chance. Now, our guy is going to pay 500 million. He's still going to make a lot of money if he's lucky, but the pressure to tear the contract up has diminished. You know? So public geological information is a good investment for governments. The empirical work on what is the payoff to public geological information is showing up extraordinarily high figures. Once you get reliable public geological information, not that says it's here, it's here, it's here, but says these are the reasonable prospects, then you get a lot more interest from reputable companies. So that's part of the answer, is get public geological information. Partly as a result of all this Natural Resource Charter stuff, in 2011, the World Bank changed its policy so that it will now lend money to finance public geological information. So it'll give concessional loans through IDA to get public geological information. And the technology of getting geological information has itself changed. second, let's think back to this problem. What's the way around this problem? And the one implication of this is that it's really not a very good idea to sell all your licenses at once. You know, what you should be doing is kind of gradually radiating out. Start somewhere and gradually sell off more prospects. Wait until you've got the geological information from the first layer of discoveries. That will inform prospects in the next, and so on. Once you've sold some prospects, suppose you sell the prospects for, this little block. What you want these guys to do is generate information, not just make discoveries. You want them to, even if they find nothing, that's useful information. And for that, you've got to make sure that they actually make the investments in drilling the hole. Right? Their incentive, having got the prospects, remember, is to wait for somebody else. Wait till you sell another load of prospects. Wait till the guys who bought their prospects near you do the drilling. Okay? So you've got to counter that. And the way to counter that is to make the prospecting rights time-bound. So you say, you've got prospecting rights, but they're only rights for the next 3 years. If you don't actually spend the money to look what's in the ground, you forfeit the prospecting rights. So time-bound prospecting right. Conditional upon actual investment in search. Okay? Anything, we'll come back to this, but anything that you regulate, you've got to monitor. And anything you've got to monitor, you've got to build the capacity to monitor. Now, a lot of countries don't have much capacity. Right? So that tells you you should be very economical in what you decide to monitor. Okay? You should only monitor things that really, really matter. But then, if it really, really matters and you're monitoring it, you better devote the resources to building the capacity to monitoring. If you don't monitor, nothing's going to, it's just going to be a rule that's ignored. Every time you have a rule that's ignored, it undermines the credibility of the government, in not just in that area, but in all other areas. Okay, so that's the discovery process. Let's just go back for a moment and say, what do you know now that you probably didn't know at 9 o'clock? What do you know about discovery? You know that in a lot of poor countries, the discovery process has gone very badly wrong. How do you know that? Because so little was discovered. Right? Right? That has to be a symptom of some assumption. But it also tells you that the discovery process getting it right is going to be hugely important in coming years through your lifetimes, because most of the resources of poor countries haven't been discovered yet. So what you've learned fundamentally is that as of the year 2000, the systems you had were not up to the job of getting resource discovery adequate. That there's a huge payoff to getting them right. And so there's a big job in getting that process right. That getting it right basically means cracking some big problems that are intrinsic to information. It's not a market which works well. A good starting point is public geological information, investing in public geological information. I'll give you an example. And let's learn from America. Not America in America, but America in operating where America knew it really had to get serious. The context in which America knew it really had to get serious was Afghanistan, right? Where the war was going very badly. And so what America did was do exactly what I'm suggesting. America invested its own money in generating public geological information for Afghanistan. And the technology it used was aerial surveillance. So you fly planes very low, and they gradually build up a pretty decent map of the geology. When they did that, they were astounded. It became actually the front page story on the New York Times. It was the good news story of the day, because the banner headline in the New York Times read, $2 trillion of natural resources in Afghanistan. Not 2 billion, 2 trillion. Right? New York Times then got in touch with me and said, will you write an article on what this implies for Afghanistan? Right? So I did that. But that was a sensible thing to do. You know? Now, America has only done that in Afghanistan because in Afghanistan it really, back to the wall, you better do whatever it takes. But that process hasn't been done in most poor countries. The World Bank's now got a strategy, I think it's called something like the $1 billion geological prospecting strategy, just try and get the whole geology of Africa map. And like everything done by big organizations, it's a bit grandiose, but the spirit is right. Get some public geological information. The payoff is enormous. If there's $2 trillion under Afghanistan, heaven knows what there is underneath Africa. So you've learned that, and then you've learned that the process of selling prospecting rights should be partly designed to generate a sequence of information. And that means that not just do you sell the rights gradually, but you regulate to require the investment in search. Now, there are a couple of people with questions. I think you were first.
Yeah. I just wanted to know, what would be the solution in a situation where some investors already know where the resources are? You know, they come with knowledge
Yeah.
already.
Yeah.
For example, we have places like where I come from in Tanzania, we are told that the Germans, of course, ruled East Africa.
Yeah, so they know and you don't. Yeah.
Exactly. They did
Yeah.
that earlier. So
Yes.
they have that information. So what do we do as a country?
Yeah.
They know very well.
Absolutely. So we're actually going to cover that in the next little block, which is taxation. Because what you're pointing to is what's called asymmetric information. The companies know more than the government. Huh? And so we're going to look at what are the techniques for dealing with asymmetric information. Okay? Now, having said that, public geological information is actually part of the answer. Try and know better what you've got. You know? That levels the playing field somewhat. So public geological information is in part an answer to that asymmetric information problem. But we're going to do it much more thoroughly in a moment. Yeah.
Yeah, as you mentioned the process, which was rightly said, one of my questions is that in countries where, say you were there as a president, you know nothing about what is going on, or you don't even know whether there is even resource under the ground there. First of all, there are some aerial images technologies that developed countries use. They don't have to come to your country. They could find out some characteristics to know that there may be this before they actually approach. Second of all, when one person comes and insists that I want to do this, I want to talk about single source and not auctioning. Is there not a good way to actually sell? Because the option you gave us was a lot of booking bidding, where people bid. But countries like Ghana have always used the first come first serve system because they haven't invested in the geological information. They have some basic information about the belt. But in terms of drilling down to know whether actually there is this here, and they have adopted the first come first serve, which have never changed. Countries who have been inclined to that, is there a better way to manage it that way?
Yeah. Again, we're going to tackle this more when we, in a sense, discovery and taxation are sort of intimately related. So I'm going to take quite a lot of it in the taxation part. But broadly, the answer is that competition is your friend. And so what you need is some form of structured competition between informed companies. Because only by structured competition between informed companies are they forced to reveal inadvertently what the stuff is worth. And what companies most prefer is what Ghana's done, which is first come, first served. And first come, first served. Who's going to be the first off the plane suppose a country's coming out of military dictatorship, civil war, whatever mess, right? Who's going to be the first off the plane? Is this going to be the Norwegian Statoil and Shell and British Petroleum or something, the companies with big reputations to lose? No, right? It's going to be Paul's Oil, registered in the Cayman Isles last month, with Paul and his wife as the directors, and Paul's bank as the bank, and so in other words, the first off the plane are not necessarily the most desirable companies. And of course, they'll tell you exactly why first come, first serve is best. Because they're the first who will be served. but we'll come back to that when we look at taxation. Anything else? Yeah.
Can I just, do we know what percentage of Africa is mapped? And also, how can we be so confident when you say majority of natural resources in
Right. Okay. There's mapped and mapped. So it depends when was it mapped, right? Because the technology has improved a lot. So I remember sitting with for example, the Mozambique's Minister of Natural Resources, and she said, "Oh, we don't need to do this. We did this in 1984." Now, maybe 1984 is good enough, and maybe it isn't. You know, we've had 30 years of technological improvements in geological surveying. And you don't have to map the whole damn place in one go. You know, there's no necessary advantage in doing everything. You know, for example, oil companies don't prove reserves. They only prove reserves as they need them. You know? So. Because it's costly to get detailed geological information. So it's sensible to start with one area, get some good information there, and gradually build out, you know. Yeah.
So I have one point in your...
Oh, I'm sorry, there was a follow-up. I knew there was a second part to your question. How can we be so confident that most of Africa's resources are not discovered? It's the Roger Myerson point, which is that we do know from basic statistical theory that the means of random processes over very large numbers, the means will be the same. If you've got the same random process done 100 times there and 100 times there, the means are going to be more or less the same. And we've no particular reason to think that over a vast area like Africa or Central Asia, the means are going to be very different from the mean over the OECD. You know. We know that there's been more discovery in the OECD, more search in the OECD, because the governance has been more conducive to search. And the search could be by companies based locally. You know, there's more search in Australia because a lot of Australian companies, natural resource companies. Okay. Was there any?
I have one question.
Yeah, sorry.
So originally in your first exercise, basically when you said you had these hypothetical 1 billion value resources with 1/10 probability, that should be your value of information, right? Because in that case you had that information. Not many countries originally had that information. They just assumed that they had a massive resources, but they can't even tell the probability of.
Yeah.
I mean.
No, that's perfectly fair. I used it just to, you know, it's a teaching device to set up a well-defined problem so that you can then see the implications, one particular implication. I should say that even when you get, the example I gave was actually not far off in oil discoveries, the point at which it becomes sensible to drill a well is the point at which there is about a 1 chance in 9 of finding something. And so that's the average success rate, strike rate, for drilling an oil well is about 1 in 9. You know, you can get the geological knowledge up to about that level, and then you dig the hole. you drill the hole. We're going to pick that up later in the day, that 1 in 9 figure, because it's going to create a potential expectations nightmare. Anybody from Liberia? Oh, that's a shame. Because Liberia had a prospect of offshore oil, and there's a lot of excitement. And there's a couple of wells being drilled, and they're both dry. And I think it's now unlikely there'll be any more drilled, So Liberia went through all the excitement of, God, we're going to be rich. But actually they weren't. And, the realistic prospect was never that, they might. The prospect was, we may be lucky, but probably we won't be. But that's very difficult psychologically to handle.
Just on the Liberia. So why did Chevron go there, for example, which is Chevron, which is a big player going to a market of that nature, which is virgin?
Oh, because the economics of 1 in 9 works, as it were. It's not worth trying to spend more on the geology. Once you've got it down to 1 in 9, it's worth spending the, whatever it is, millions of dollars to hire the oil rig and go and have a look. Because the one time in 9 when it works pays big enough to cover the other 8 that don't. And that's incidentally why there's a sort of genuine need to have pretty big payoffs when things work, because they're actually paying for the 8 cases that don't. Right? So the return on the normal return on capital has to include recovering the cost of those 8 failures as well as the one success. Right? So the companies are legitimately going to make big profits on the successful strikes. That still leaves big rents. Right? As it were, the $20 to the cost of getting the oil out includes not just the cost of getting this oil out, but the cost of drilling the 8 wells that didn't find anything. Last question. Is it somebody who hasn't asked it? You've not asked a question. Right? Yeah. Okay.
Are there circumstances in which you think it would be worth encouraging a state-owned enterprise to be created?
Yeah. Oh, sure. I mean, so public geological information, as I said, it doesn't mean that the government has itself to do the geology. It means it has to either do it or buy it, right? And then release the information. That's the important thing, is get the information out. Whether it's sensible, at one extreme, you don't do anything. You just commission a specialist company to get the information, and then you put it out on the web, basically. At the other extreme, you set up a national oil company that does that. And where along that spectrum you operate depends upon basically the capacities within the country. If this is your first shot at oil, you don't know whether you've got any, it's really not sensible investing in the enormous effort of building a national oil company when you might not have any oil to be national about, I mean, I know the chairman of Liberia's national oil company, but he's got a job, but he hasn't got any oil to be national about. So there's a spectrum. It depends on how much of the resource you've got, how long it'll last, and are you abundant in skilled people who can readily become expert in this area. Norway's big advantage when it set up Statoil was that it already had a very big sea-related industry, basically fishing, building fishing boats, that whole technology. And so in operating in very cold water. So it already had a lot, it didn't know how to get oil out of the sea, but it knew a lot about operating in the sea and building things that operate in the sea. So it was a relatively small step to move into an oil company.